Okay, welcome back. We are now going to start talking about animal diversity. We've gone through a lot of the tree of life so far. So we've discussed microbes, archaea, and bacteria, and then protists, and then fungi, and then plants. Now, in plants, we did get drill down a little bit and talk about the four phyla of plants, right? We had the mosses and ferns and gymnosperms and angiosperms. And that's what the level that we're going to discuss with the animals. We're going to go through all of the animal phyla and kind of major evolutionary innovations along the way. So let's open that up. This is chapter 15, and it's a really quick run through animal diversity. So first we'll just define what is an animal. It may seem kind of obvious, but there are some scientific criteria. We're going to talk about invertebrates and then vertebrates, things with backbones, and then specifically the terrestrial vertebrates, those that have moved on to land because there were a lot of evolutionary innovations required there. So how do we define an animal? All animals are heterotrophs, meaning they don't make their own food. No, there are no photosynthetic animals. They have to eat something else, whether that be a plant or another animal. No animals can photosynthesize, as I said. They all are able to move in at least one phase of life. Not necessarily all phases of life, but they have some movement at some point, and they're all multicellular. All animals share a common protist ancestor. And if you were paying attention, you might say, wait, I thought that protists were the ancestors of plants. And they are, which is why you may recall I also said that protists are not one clearly defined group. There's a lot of different protists that are not necessarily closely related to one another. And some are the ancestors of plants, and some are the ancestors of animals. So there are four developmental distinctions among animals that help us put them into categories. So most animals are defined by these developmental groups. That's how we decide which phyla they're going into. So the first one is whether the animal has any specialized cells that form tissues. If not, it's a sponge. Okay, so porifera. And for these, you do need to know their scientific phyla name. Okay, so porifera are the sponges. You can think of them as having lots of pores, okay? Um, if they do have cells that form specialized tissues, then we go on to the next question. Does it have radial symmetry, which means in a circle, right, you could cut it any which way? Or does it have bilateral symmetry, whereas, you cut it down the side? All non-sponges have some kind of symmetry, but it varies whether they have radial or bilateral. If it's bilateral, then you ask the next question, does the mouth develop first or does the anus develop first, right? We start with a ball of cells and then it kind of caves inward. And the question is that caving in, is that a mouth or an anus? Um, Protostomes are the majority of the bilateral symmetrical animals, but deuterostomes are a smaller group. So those will be your chordates, things that have like a spinal cord, and also spiny, the echinoderms, spiny skin organisms like sea urchins and sand dollars. So we're actually very closely related to sea urchins and sand dollars. Um, If it's a mouth first organism, though, the next question is, does it occur by molting, like shedding its skin, or does it just continually grow? So those are the main four developmental categories that help us sort animals. So these are the phyla, and you do need to know these names. Okay, so there's porifera, which are sponges, and Cnidaria, which are jellyfish and sea anemone and coral, platyhelminthes, which are flatworms, and we're going to go through all of these. Nematodes, which are roundworms, annelids, which are segmented worms. We've got a lot of different kinds of worms. They're not closely related to each other. We just call them worms, but that doesn't mean anything scientifically. Mollusks like squid and octopus and snails, and arthropods, which are crustaceans, but also spiders and insects. Echinoderms, which I mentioned, those are your sea stars and sand dollars, and then chordata. These are include the vertebrates. Not every chordate is a vertebrate, though. Okay, so let's go through some of these invertebrates, okay, which is the vast majority of animals. Sponges are the first one. Remember, these have no special tissue diversification. They do have some different cell types, though. It's just those cells don't form a tissue. Um, they have epidermal cells on the outside, and on the inside, they have collar cells. So if we were to draw um, a sponge, they have different shapes, but some of them may be tubes. They have all these like pores in them, and water comes in, and on the inside, they have these special cells that I'm just going to draw with little spiky things. Um, and those have flagella that kind of beat and that helps the water movement. And then they just filter food as it's coming inside. Sponges are hermaphrodites, meaning that they can produce both eggs and sperm, but they can only do one at a time. So they're not self-fertilizing, but if they find that, hey, I'm surrounded by a bunch of other females, they can become a male. And if it looks like there's more males around, they could become a female. The males can just release a cloud of sperm into the water, right? And the sperm can kind of float around and fertilize a female sponge. Their eggs do develop into larvae. So this is their mobile stage. Remember, all animals need to be able to move at some point in their life. Sponge larvae do swim until they settle onto a rock or a piece of coral, and then they grow and become sessile or non-moving later in their life. They can also reproduce asexually. So if you've got a sponge, you could break off a piece and it can go grow on its own. So it doesn't have to be sexual reproduction. Okay, our next group of phyla of animals are jellyfish, which are cnidarian. So these are jellyfish, but also sea anemones and coral. These, remember, our next big developmental stage is whether there's symmetry. And these are the organisms that have radial symmetry. So as you can see, right, you could cut this anemone in parts like a pie, right? Or a jellyfish as a pie. All of these are carnivorous and have stinging cells. Now, our next big evolutionary step, we've got a few things that evolved. 3 tissue layers, bilateral symmetry. So we're now, you can cut them in half, but not in, in a pie. Cephalization, which means a head. So there's a front end, right? If you're going to be bilateral, there's a front end that goes first, and a coelom, which is kind of an inner tube. And this would be your digestive tract. Now, these things were all gained. They have since been lost in a few things like snails, or not snails, sorry, but the same group as snails, clams, right? Clams don't have a head. So some mollusks have lost their cephalization. Flatworms have lost their coelom because they're totally flat. But most lineages have these 4 major evolutionary adaptations. Okay, so we're going to talk next about worms. As I said, there are 3 different kinds. They're not closely related. It's just that we call them all worms because they have a similar body shape and look similar to us. So flatworms are Platyhelminthes. Plat rhymes with flat. They have no body cavity, so these do not have a coelom. They don't have a respiratory tract or a circulatory system, but they can digest. Most are hermaphrodites. Again, just like sponges, they can be male and female, and often at the same time. Some are parasitic, like tapeworms, and some are non-parasitic. So these are other flatworms. So this is a picture of a non-parasitic flatworm, a little Platyhelminthes. So they have these little eye spots that can sense light, and they just kind of swim around. They're really just 2-dimensional. Okay, another group of worms are roundworms. These grow by molting. Remember I said that there were, whether you molt or continually grow is a big developmental distinction among different animals. Many live in the soil. They may be parasites. Some are animal parasites as well. So anybody here who has a dog, if you give them heartworm medicine every month, heartworms are a type of roundworm. Their scientific name is nematode. So Nematoda is our phyla here. And here's a picture of a nematode. And then the third group of worms are the segmented worms. These are the ones that you're familiar with, that you see outside as you're gardening and stuff like that. Probably the vast majority of the worms you've ever seen in your life fall into this category. These are segmented worms. They include the earthworm, but also leeches and some like sea worms. These grow not by molting, but by adding tissue. So they just grow like we do. They just get bigger. Some are parasites like leeches, and some digest dead material and are decomposers like earthworms. Okay, our next group of animals are the mollusks. This is a pretty diverse group. So it includes, I've got three main groups here. Gastropods, so this means stomach, foot. These are things that crawl around on their stomach like snails and slugs. Bivalves, which mean they have two valves. These are things like clams and mussels. And then cephalopod means that they have heads coming out of their feet coming out of their head, foot. And these are things like the octopus and the squid. And we'll go through each of these three groups. All mollusks do have defined tissues as is required, right? Bilateral symmetry, not radial, even though, you know, an octopus seems like it may be more circular. It's actually, this is radial symmetry, and they grow by adding tissues. So we've got our gastropods, bellyfoot. These are most mollusks, so snails, slugs, things like that. Our next are the bivalves. They have two hinged shells, and they feed by filtering. So these guys have lost their heads, right? They have so they've lost a trait that had evolved earlier. No cephalization. And then when we're talking about cephalization heads, we have these guys with their feet coming right out of their heads. The nautilus, the octopus, and the squid are all cephalopods. Okay, our next group is the arthropod, which is extremely diverse. These are insects, but also crustaceans, millipedes, centipedes, spiders. There's a lot of subgroups here. So arthropods are about 60% of all species on Earth. They're all bilaterally symmetrical. They're all invertebrates and have segmented bodies, and they all have an exoskeleton made of chitin. Remember, chitin is also what fungal cell walls are made of. That's how we know that fungi are closer related to animals. And finally, the last group of invertebrates that we will discuss are echinoderms. This means spiny skin. And these are different from all these other invertebrates because they're deuterostomes. So we're going to talk about that. So a deuterostome means the gut forms from the back to the front. It's anus first, not mouth first. As they're developing, this ball of cells caves inward. For the echinoderms and chordates, that is the anus, not the mouth, that forms. Eventually, it works its way, all the way through and comes out the other end. For all organisms, right? There's an in and there's an out, but it's which one forms first. These are sea stars, sand dollars, and sea urchins, and they're all very spiny, as you can see in that picture. Their larvae are bilaterally symmetrical, but the adults are radially symmetrical. So they cover both categories here. And finally, we get to chordates. So we are going to talk about chordates next, and kind of some special characteristics that they have. So there are 4 special characteristics of chordates. The first is they have a notochord. This is the rod of tissue that goes from the head to the tail. In vertebrates, this is our vertebral column. Okay, but for others that don't have vertebrae, there's still a rod of tissue that kind of adds some stability. There's also a nerve cord. For us, we would call this our, our spinal cord, not the vertebrae, but the actual nerves that are going through there. This forms the central nervous system. So all chordates have this central nervous system that has a head and a brain. The third characteristic is pharyngeal slits. So these would be slits right along the neck. In fish, you'd recognize these as gills. But we all have them at some point in an embryonic phase. So if you remember back to when we were talking about evidence for evolution and we looked at anatomical similarities, you'll remember that the turtle and the chicken both had some embryonic gills. And then all chordates have a post-anal tail. So this means that we have a tailbone, right? It may not be external to the body, but it is there. Now there are three major groups of chordates, vertebrates being the most common. So they are tunicates and lancelets, which you've probably never heard of and may never see in your life, and then vertebrates. So tunicates are little invertebrate marine animals. The adults actually look like blobs of jelly. They actually look more like sponges. So I have an adult here on the right. The larvae look much more animal-like. They have tails and heads, right? And can move. So this is an interesting thing. As chordates were developing, kind of the first one to develop, um, had a different adult phase and a larval phase. And then that transition from larva to adult was kind of lost. And so the other chordates maintain their larval phase. You can think of us as being larvae, basically, right? We still look like our baby phase. We don't develop into a blob, but that's kind of the way that chordates were heading, looking like blobs as adults. So all the other chordates retain larval phase throughout life. So the next one is a lancelet. This looks like a little fish, really, but it doesn't have a vertebrae. So that's our big difference here. It's not a vertebrate, but it really looks like one. And then we get to vertebrates. This is our most diverse group of chordates. The vertebrates are the ones that you've seen, and they differ from the other chordates, the lancelets and the tunicates, in a few important ways. We now have a backbone surrounding that spinal cord. And that head is formed by a skull. So it's a bony head with a brain in it. And I think we're going to pause here and then we will pick up discussing more classifications and groups of vertebrates in the next lecture.